Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Voice of Reason. We are so excited to have season 3 and to start with that tonight. We had two wonderful seasons before this one, and we're so excited for what is to come. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm here in this seat, because you're so used to seeing Apostle Carel. But that is because we have two wonderful guests here with us tonight, and that is Apostle Carel himself and Apostle Hilana, who is going to share with us tonight, and we're very excited to have you guys here. Very much welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
A lot of you might know this, but some of you might not. But we are celebrating our 20-year celebration this year at HRC Pretoria, which we are very excited about and very happy to do. And with a 20-year celebration, obviously there has to be people who have been in the leadership team for those 20 years. And that is the reason why they're here tonight, because they were the people that led our church for these last 20 years here in Pierre van Ryneveld. And it's been an absolute privilege for me to be under the ministry, I think, for the last 2 years now, going on 3 years, but I've obviously known them my entire life as we are family. But it has just been a privilege to be under their ministry and to learn from them and to see them impart their knowledge into the congregation. So I'm very excited to draw from that wisdom tonight, and I'm excited for you guys to hear what wisdom comes with 20 years of ministry in one region, town, because they've been in ministry for much longer than that. But don't let me tell you. I'm going to hand over to them, and let's just quickly find out more about you guys. Carel, you have been pastoring long before you got to Harvester. Just tell us, how did you end up getting into ministry? What was your journey into, making that decision of heading into ministry?
Yeah, what a privilege to be in this seat tonight. Wonderful to just think back on the last 20 years in this locality. And my journey started in Namibia in a little town called Swakopmund, where I got saved in a small church. My mum was the one that got saved first, and then she took me to church against my will, let me put it like that. So it wasn't a sort of a thing that I wanted to do at that stage. I think I was standard 7. What's that? That's standard 9. Grade 9 nowadays. When I gave my life to the Lord in a Sunday evening service. So what happened was that they discovered that I could play a bit of piano, and we had a wonderful lady, Tannie Hina Cronje. We saw her again just now recently when we went to Namibia for that outreach and that mission trip, and she trained me on the piano, and so I played piano long before I was saved, even. So I've got a bit of grace with people, in the worship team nowadays, who's not perfect yet, and I got saved behind the piano on a Sunday evening, and I knew immediately when I got saved that God put His hand on my life for ministry's sake. And it was confirmed as well very quickly after I got saved through prophetic word and so on. And so I started my ministry even immediately then, I started in the school, and you're involved in schools a lot nowadays. So that's where I also started in my local or my school that I was in. And it grew, and by the time that I got into matric, they asked me actually to stay a year longer. So I did my first year of ministry as sort of a trainee in the church there and a youth pastor. And then from there we came to do the studies at Rao. And my first church that I was a youth pastor in is in Kempton Park with Pastor Bertie Vort in the AFM. And there I spent about 4 years. That's the time that I was doing my studies. Was one of, I think we were 29 pastors in the church there. So big macro church, and so I got a bit of experience in the big church thing. And then from there, because I was a plattelandse oukie. What's that in English?
A rural guy. You were a rural
Somebody
guy.
coming from Namibia,
A farm
small
boy.
town,
Farm
rural
boy.
sort of guy. The church in Babsfontein, their pastor took a call to, I think it was Alice Russ, and the region asked me, the Apostolic Faith Mission asked me to go to Babsfontein, and so I struggled to find the town at first because it was so rural. You had to find a four-way stop street, and from there we went into the gravel roads and found the church there. So I helped out as a final year student in Babsfontein, and that's where I got to know Mom and Dad. I was on the board that took the call for them to come, and and then I spent, that's where I met Hilana, my beautiful wife. There we spent, I think it was 6 years. And then we knew we wanted to get married. She could talk a bit about that. And in that
I knew I wanted to get married.
Yeah, she knew she wanted to get married to me. And wonderful years in Babsfontein as well. And then the Lord spoke to us about the church plant that we had to do. At first I was very rebellious about it. I always thought that church planting was for the guys who were rebels, They just want to split churches and so on. I wasn't prone church planting, but I knew the Lord put his hand upon us. And Dad actually took me, I don't know if you were with us, but we came to Pierre van Ryneveld. We drove through Pierre van Ryneveld, and this was an area that the church said that there was no Pentecostal or charismatic sort of church in the area. And with Dad, we stopped there in Hertzog Street, and we prayed there, and we got out of the car at the entrance there where the shopping center is now, coming into Pierre van Ryneveld, Irene Mall, and we stood there and prayed over the area. And Dad gave me a book on church planting by, I think it was by Rick Warren, so many years ago. So that's how I got my head around it. And I went to those days, it was Doc Sadeo, Pastor Johan Stein, spoke to him about what the Lord spoke to us about, and he helped us to get going in this area, just to set our mind and our thinking on it. And then we started the church in, you need to help me now, it was April 2003. And April 2003. And and that's where our journey in Pierre van Ryneveld started. So my first church in Kempton, then in Babsfontein, and then we came to plant the church now 20 years ago. So maybe Hilana can share a bit on her journey up until that point, and then we can maybe speak a bit from there.
So as you can see, I'm much younger than Carel.
Not really.
Yes, really. So by the time I went to varsity, Carel had finished varsity. So there you know exactly how much older he is than me. So I was a matric when I met him. So I think it was the June, July of my matric year. My parents moved back to Babsfontein. So my father's first congregation was in Babsfontein when I was 7 years old. And his last congregation was in Babsfontein. So they announced in my matric year that they're moving back to Babsfontein. I wasn't very impressed initially. Being in your matric year, it was a bit difficult. But nonetheless, we moved and I got to meet Carel. He was the youth pastor. Our friendship started there. It was a bit rocky initially. We didn't really like each other that much, but as you can see, we like each other now, so that's good. My journey is a bit different than Carel's in the sense that I grew up in a Pentecostal house, and from a young age I was exposed to Jesus, to the working of the Holy Spirit, to worship in a different way. So I'm really privileged to say that I was raised like that. So thank you, Mom and Dad. We are really privileged as children to have
been raised like that. I remember being 7 years old when I gave my heart to Jesus, and it was really an impact moment. I remember it. You don't often remember things when you were 7 years old, but I really do remember the moment I gave my heart to Jesus. And yeah, I've never been in a place in my life where I have lived different to that. So that's amazing. I think it's amazing. If I look back over my life, I feel very privileged to have had that privilege to know Jesus from a young age. Anyway, so yeah, when I was in matric, I ended up wanting to go to varsity, obviously. So for the first 4 years that Carel and myself knew each other, I was studying at UJ Rao. Well, it was still Rao when I studied there, and he had just finished his studies at Rao. So we just actually saw each other over weekends mainly, and I helped him with the youth and so on. And we eventually started dating. And before we got engaged, Carel came to me and he said, well, the Lord has spoken to him about planting a church. I was in my first year after studies. So I was working my 2 years for the government. I'm a nurse. So you have to work 2 Zuma years, that's what we call it. And I worked it in Babsfontein, in a clinic in Babsfontein, which to me was a miracle. If you know the stories of all the medical people being placed, they get placed in different provinces and far away from their family. And I actually got a placing in Babsfontein. And Carel just explained to you now how small Babsfontein is. So it was really a miracle. I was working in the community health care center there as a professional nurse. And then Carel came to me. I think I was like working for 4 months or 5 months. Carel came to me and said, no, the Lord is speaking to him about planting a church. And what he was basically saying to me is that he's going to move. So initially I wasn't that excited because, I mean, he was living just in the house behind my parents. Everything was in Babsfontein. My work was in Babsfontein. So initially I was a bit resistant to the thought of planting a church and going away from my parents. It made sense to me at that stage to stay where they were. But I also could hear that Carel was very serious about the fact that the Lord was speaking to him about it and he couldn't not obey. So I was in a bit of a difficult situation because we were just dating. We weren't engaged or anything. And I was obviously helping my dad in the church. Carel was also helping a lot. By then he wasn't the youth pastor anymore. He was
assistant pastor. And Claude was the youth pastor.
My elder brother was the youth pastor.
Yeah.
So it was difficult for me to say to my dad, okay, I'm also leaving. So Carel is leaving. That's sad. But I'm also leaving, and that's very sad. So my dad was a bit disappointed, I think, to say the least, when we both decided to go, because for him it was difficult, because we were both in the ministry team, and we were both in the band, and we were carrying some weight, but we just had to do it, and it made sense for me to go with Carel. So we planted the church in the April, but in a house with people that we barely knew. It was actually it's insane what we actually had guts for. I was 23 years old and Carel was 28, just to give you an idea. We were really very, very young. And I do think it's difficult, or let's say a little bit more difficult, to plant a church when you're that young, because people are like, okay, but you're children. So do we have to come to your church now? Are you sure you know the Bible? Can you actually do this? So I think the beginning was a bit difficult, but the first people we planted the church with were elderly people, in the sense that I think the children were just in high school.
Yeah, they were teenagers. Yeah.
So they were about the age that we are now. I think maybe a bit younger.
Yeah, the parents.
Parents. So they were our first family. And then I think about a few months later, the July, Carel actually did then end up asking me to marry him. And we got married the next year, the February. So we actually planted the church together before we got married.
Yeah.
And at a very, very young age. But I'm grateful that we started at 23 and 28. Because we're not close to 50 yet, and we've learned a lot, and we can just apply it as we continue in our lives.
Well, on that note, I was just sat here thinking, I'm 26 now, and I think I would lose my mind if I have to plant a church now. It seems like a very scary thought to me, so I can imagine what went through your minds. So while we're touching on that matter, if possible, can you maybe share with us some fears you have? Because I think a lot of people who will be watching might be church leaders who want to plant a church or is looking at planting a church. Some fears that you had when planting the church and how you overcame it.
Well, Hilana might speak a bit on that, but I think when you're that young,
You're just
you're also
stupid.
inexperienced and you're a bit stupid.
Whatever.
So
Yeah,
you
a bit
just
more
go for it,
confidence.
And that was sort of a positive thing, We were very excited about what the Lord told us to do. That scripture that the Lord sent us with was the scripture that said, I'm going to do a new thing.
Isaiah, it's in
Isaiah, yes. Can you see it? Can you expect it? And at that time, we didn't understand exactly what the new thing would be, but we know at least it was going to be a new plant. And so I think initially, God just supplied in miraculous ways, I just have to say this as well. Right from the word go in my life, I was involved with pioneering things. So the apostolic mandate of my life was there right from the word go. When I got saved in Swakop, in Namibia, in that season, we were busy as a church planting another church in a little town called Henties Bay. And I took the kids there in Ilana. We spent some time there recently as well. So right from the word go, I was in a church planting place, people thinking about church planting. Also, as a young student going back to Namibia, I used to drive to small towns, places like Omaruru and Isakos, to go and do services there. Very small, also looking to plant churches. So that was right from the beginning. Babsfontein, when I got there, it was so small. I think we were 7 or 8 people in the church. I played the piano, and we always joked about it because the piano at the back, the steel frame was broken. So you could play any key, you would fit your voice into that because that thing was so out of tune. And when Dad came to join, or when we got together with him as well, it was a wonderful thing because the church actually, it was like a church plant. It grew, and from nothing, God did something wonderful in Babsfontein. And by the time we left, we finished the big building project. So the Lord always, we weren't finished with it. We were quite in the middle of the thing, but me and Ilana was so involved even with that I sort of already had some experience at that age about doing something from nothing, being in the places that God had placed me in. But obviously one of the fear of the unknown is a big thing, walking by faith. God only trains you if you're in it, you're trained to walk by faith when you're in that moment of very fearful things that you tackle and you start with. But the supernatural hand of God, the grace of God, that's where you lean in on. There's a couple the first couple we started the church with. In the last week that we were in the church office, I think you were with me that day. I can't remember anymore.
I was working in the clinic.
But yeah, I was at the church office, and this guy came in the middle of nowhere and knocked at the door, and he was going through some difficulties, and I managed to counsel him a bit in the office. So he just took his car and drove into the bushes, and he found the church there in the middle of nowhere. And I gave him, and I asked him, where do you stay? And he replied, in this area, in Centurion area. And I immediately said, okay, I'll come and do a house call with you, and I'll go meet your wife and everybody, and I'll walk a road with you. And in that first house call, I challenged them to become the first people to plant the church with me, So that was the initiating thing. When I got there, which is also miraculous, is that when I was on my first year as a student, I bought a car from them.
Oh,
So I never knew them then, but I recognized the house that I stopped with, and I bought his car, and went into the house, met his children, and so God brought us back together. So there was previous connection, and his wife had our surname, Marais. And when I started to speak to her, I met her dad, who was the chairman of the board of a church in Vereniging that put a call out for me a year or so previous to that, and I met her dad. So suddenly God brought connections that caused them to think, okay, this might work. And that became our first family. So there's many such miracles. But the walk of faith is still a walk of faith, you know. In Babsfontein, that year, the last year that I was in Babsfontein was the first year that I got a salary. Fixed salary. Previous to that, and we were there 6 years, for the first 5 years, I only got what was left, you know, so sort of thing. And I ate with mom and dad in the house because there was not enough money to give me enough money for my own food and stuff, you know. So it was, like I say, a pioneering journey. So I was used to living by faith and so on. And then when we left, you know, just having that 1 year of security in a salary that came in, it was difficult to do that, to trust the Lord for that. But you know, God is so awesome. In that first years when we got married as well, there was somebody that paid over the exact amount that was my salary in Babsfontein for about how long? 3 years?
I can't remember.
We didn't know who it came from, and it always came on different dates. So we never knew if it's going to come, if it's not going to come, you know. But God, there were times that we were crying and say, Lord, we can't anymore. You know, where do we go from now? Hilana famously tells the story how she got in the car and looked at the cents that she had, and that was that. But at the right moments, just before we were about to give up, there came a breakthrough and the money came in. Maybe from your perspective, you know, that's the big thing. So the big thing is the fear of the unknown. God is awesome in the miracles that He works and how you know, the people that met up and joined the church, that's all miracles in the beginning. But yeah, that fear of the unknown, and then learning to walk by faith, to wait on God for the provision, and also to do what you can to get it done. She worked, you know, so maybe you can just give that perspective a bit.
Yeah, I think maybe I must just start with the story in Mark 6. It's been on my mind for the last 2 days. We're doing a Bible reading thing, and it was yesterday or the day before was reading, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. And the first thing He says to the disciples, when the disciples ask Him, the disciples actually suggest, listen, just send these people away so that they can still get food, because it's not too late for them to get food, because their thinking is, we can't provide these people with food. 5,000 people, how are we going to feed 5,000 people? And Jesus says, well, what do you have? And they reply and they say, well, this is what we've got, fish and bread. And He says, okay, start handing it out. And in the handing out, the multiplication happens. And I feel that is like a bit of a summary of how we had to learn to live. Even today we spoke about it again. We still live
like that, yeah.
That is what we need to do in the situation that we are facing currently, is just the Lord is saying, what do you have? And we're like, okay, we've got this. And then the Lord will multiply it, and He will do what He needs to do with it if you surrender it to Him. But there's another key, and the other key is that you can't just sit and wait for Him to do that. But in the actual walking it out, the multiplication happens. So as they were handing out the food, the multiplication actually happened. It wasn't in them sitting and waiting for the baskets to fill up, and then once the baskets were full, they took it under their arms and they started handing it out. It was actually an act of faith in the handing out as well. And I think that's basically a summary of how we had to learn to live in the beginning, and now it's kind of become, don't want to say it's a norm, because it still does take some applying to live like that, but it's much easier. So because we were young, we didn't have a lot of responsibilities, which I guess was good. It was in our favor. I think when you're older and you already have children, it must be more difficult to actually decide, I'm leaving my steady income for something that I'm not sure is actually going to pay for me. So forever, it's only the last 2 years that I haven't actually been working as a nurse, but for the first we've been married for 19 years. So for the first 15 years, I had to continuously work because that was our steady income. Fortunately, I loved what I was doing, so that it wasn't a burden for me, and it still isn't a burden for me to work at all. But yeah, I had to work, and I remember my first salary was 4,000 rand. So that was the money we definitely had. We
The
were
others were
assured
maybe.
of. The rest, yeah, we had to hope for. And we were then living in Pretoria. After we got married, we moved to Pierre van Ryneveld, actually in flats just behind the tent. You can actually see our previous house from
From
the
here,
tent.
yeah.
I can't remember. I think the rent was 4,600 rand. I don't know why I remember
Something
that
like
amount.
that, yeah.
And you just heard that my salary was 4,000, and I had a car, and obviously I had a monthly installment on it. Carel had a car with a monthly installment, and I had to drive to Babsfontein every day, because that's where my work was. That's where I had to work my 2 Zuma years. So that's about 32 kilometers. As ek nou wil nitpick, 32 kilometers to Babsfontein and back every day. So that's a bit of petrol. So we really had to trust the Lord from the word go. There wasn't like, oh yeah, it's the 25th, we've got some extra money. We just knew that without the Lord, it will never be enough. And I think the daily bread principle became part of our lives. There were many things that the Lord instilled in our lives over time, which was great. It's tools that we still need today, every single day. So I think if you do decide to plant a church, allow the Lord to teach you to live differently, because you look at the world, you look at your congregants, and you think, okay, they've got it easy in terms of they've got a set income, they can do this, they can do that. You can't necessarily live the way they live. But that's the point. You're not supposed to live the way they live. You're supposed to live differently. There's a different call on your life. There's a different purpose to your life. And you can't live differently if you live the same, if you have the same principles that you apply. And it doesn't make the one better than the other. It's just what the Lord decided we must be and what He picked us out to be, just as the Lord picked you out to be something different. There's no better than. It's just what the Lord decided we must do for Him in His kingdom. So a lot of training. Once the children came, I think it was a bit more difficult, because now you have to start hoping and trusting that everything will be there for your children and that they need. And the Lord has been exceedingly faithful in terms of that. Apostle Aja always says, if you're busy with God's dreams, you will get busy with yours.
Yeah.
And that's
Amen.
something that He's proven over time, so many times to us, that we don't even know that we're dreaming about something. And then the Lord provides
and there's
for that.
also those moments where the Lord just blesses you. There's something you don't even expect, So we learn to live by faith, and we still learn live like that. Yeah. So it's part and parcel of the journey. If you want to do what we do with church planting, we started off in St. George's Chapel, the chapel there at the hotel, and it was 500 rand per service that they asked us, and then they would give us the coffee and cake after the service, So it was incredible. So
Sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah. We planted the church in September of that year. We started with a household in April, and then by September we said, okay, we're ready, let's go and officially start the church. And we had our first service the first weekend of September.
And the church literally grew by family members.
Yeah.
So this one would say, okay, no, I'm going to invite my family member, and this one's going to say, and then they invite family members. And I think by the time we moved to St. George's, we were about maybe 15 people.
15 to
10
20
to 15,
people,
yeah.
Yeah, and when we started off there, they had a piano, they had a sound system, they gave us the coffee and cake. So it was quite a nice thing to have, And we did that for about a year. Is that right? I think it was about a year that we spent there. In that time, people joined us, Deline and Billy. I'm trying to get hold of them to see if we can get them for the celebration again. But she gave us a word then. That was in that first year, that she saw a picture where we would have church in a tent. And she actually said on the corner of Pierre van Ryneveld and Dampina Road.
Oh, wow.
So that was way back, way back in the first year. And that was a prophetic word we got in that chapel. And And there I had a drummer. Yeah, we had a guy that he had long hair, Rudolph, and he was unmarried then. And I remember that was that first December, that September we planted this church, and December we were going on with services right through, and then the whole church would be me and Hilana, the drummer, and maybe one person, So it was, but I had the service, even there in the
It takes up an offering and everything.
in the house that we had, the houses, I had the piano, we worshipped, we did announcements, we took up offering, we made it, like the whole thing that you would have in church. And wonderful times, difficult times, but wonderful if we look back. And then one day we just said, all right, we can't afford this 500 Rand a month or service, a Sunday thing. We need a cheaper place, and we decided, we prayed about it, we need to go back into the community as well, because the chapel is a bit out of the local community, and we got the, what do you call it, library hall?
Yeah, just behind the tent.
Just behind the tent here. And 50 Rand a service. So that seemed good,
10% of what we used to pay. But there was no coffee, no cake.
Yeah, and we had to set everything up. We have to pitch everything up. And we didn't have a sound system. We didn't have a piano. I didn't have nothing, And by faith, I said that Sunday, okay, guys, we're going to move into the space. That Thursday, I got a phone call from a farmer in Delmas area. Now, I buried his son a few years before that, while I was the pastor with Dad there in Babsfontein. And he said I needed to come and visit him. He didn't know about the church plant at that stage. Reluctantly, I went also because we didn't have money to go all the way, But something said go, and I went. We had a braai, so we made some a meal together, spent a bit of time. And then before I had to go, he said he needs to run an errand. Would I go with him? Went with him to the bank. And I didn't know what he was going to do. When he came out, he came with a black bag full of cash. And he gave it into my hand, like a bag full of cash in a swart sak, in a black bag. And he said, the Lord said, I need to give you this. Yeah, and I was so afraid. I remember got in the car, hijacking, somebody saw me, what's happening? And I drove straight back home here to PF Renneveld, and the next morning I went to the bank, banked it, and then went to a music shop. And I bought a piano, and I bought a sound system and mics. And the Sunday morning when everybody pitched up in the new library hall, it was ready, there was sound, there was a piano, everything was set up, and we could worship. And the drummer brought his drums, and we had a wonderful time for a few years. How long would you say? About 2 years?
I think it was about 2 years, yes. And then the library hall got too small. We lived in the complex just here behind, and we managed to convert like a lot.
Yeah, we said we had a complex church. Complex kerk.
It turned out to be a complex church.
Yeah, because it's all the people that lived in the same complex, our neighbors and across the street, and Martin and Janneke.
You all know Martin and Janneke.
Yeah.
Martin and Janneke lived right next door to us.
That's the story. They would appreciate this as well, So Martin would invite us to visit with him, and he's a very expressive sort of guy. You guys who know him would know. And by the third time he invited us to them, the first time he asked me what I did. So all the other times it was just speaking about what they did, and so on. We laughed a lot. And at that time they were not saved yet. They were cursing and all sorts of stuff. And by the third visit, he asked me, what do you do? And I said to him, no, I'm a pastor. And he planted the church. That Sunday, he came to church, and they stuck for many years. And he became the drummer later on for us. So
we really lived very close to each other, because we actually shared a bedroom wall.
Yeah.
So when Martin went away for work, and in the evenings when we get into bed, we'd knock against the wall, and then Janneke would knock against the wall, and then we'd know she's fine, we're fine, and then we slept. But so the church grew quite a bit when we were in the library hall.
Wonderful.
And there were a lot of young people. I think you tend to draw the people that are your age.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Initially, and they grow with you. The church grows with you. But we drew a lot of young people and newly married people. We were,
it was
Renal and Christy,
yeah.
Vanal and Naike.
All the same.
Everyone were living in that same complex.
The same area that we were living in.
So everyone who got newly married, that was the complex to go and live in. It was actually amazing because we were a group of young people who wanted to do something for the Lord and who were actually very good friends and had a lot in common. We all had our first child together.
What was incredible for me in that season of the church is a lot of new converts.
Converts, yes.
A lot of new people. I baptized a lot of people. And all of these guys, being young, we married them. So we were at their marriage. When they got a baby, we were there. Mm-hmm. We christened the babies. So there was quite a big crowd of people our own age with that sort of similar circumstances and so on. And that carried on for quite a few years.
Yeah, well, it was about 2 years. Then we realized we had to move because we didn't have space. So we were looking everywhere for space to rent. It was a bit of a struggle, but Carel did find there's a shopping center towards the back of Pierre van Ryneveld. It's called Kirknest Shopping Center. So it's just very few shops, but it's got a second floor. So on the second floor of the shopping center, there used to be offices. So that guy had given up his rent and the property was available, but it was office space. So it was literally cubicles. And Carel said, well, this is a perfect space, but we had to remodel the whole place.
Thing, yeah.
So that was quite a story. That's another thing. If you're willing to plant a church, you must be willing to work hard.
Work hard, yeah.
Nothing just happens. So Saturdays, Carel spent many Saturdays there tiling with Yaku and Christu and just setting everything up. Yeah. And we ended up having quite a nice auditorium and then a space before the auditorium, coffee shop, children's.
Now there was actually
Sunday school,
a
quite
hall
a nice
for
Sunday
them
school.
As well. Yeah.
It was quite nice. But again, I think about after 4 years, we found ourselves in the position where the space wasn't enough. And we had to have 2 services, which was wonderful, that we had to have 2 services. But we realized that we need the next space to move to. And Carel started looking for property.
I just want to add there, you know what was nice? You were sort of, everybody knew us by then as the church next to the pub.
Oh yeah, on top of the pub. Yeah.
On top of the pub. So the 2 doors were next to one another, so going into the church up with the stairs, and the other one next to it was going into the pub. I was praying about this because that was the only space we were able to get. And then out of the blue, Apostle Andre phoned me. And he said to me, listen, I've got a word for you. The Lord says a diamond shines its brightest on a dark background. Does it mean something to you? And I'm saying, yes, we're going to have a church right next to the pub. So everybody's going to know about the church. So I know a lot of people that came from the pub to the upstairs. Nobody told me about the ones that went down the stairs into the pub. So we believe that was a good season for us as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so Carel started looking for property that we could actually move the church to. But this time we were looking for property. We were looking for a space that we could actually call our own for, on a long-term basis and maybe build a church. But he was really struggling to find something. The only property you could find was, if you just go out of the church, there's a piece of ground to your right, but it belonged to M&T, and I think they wanted $2 million for it or something insane that for it. And then one day he overheard somebody in the hardware store saying that he's looking for property, but all he can find is church property. So Carel was like, what? And Carel confronted him and he said, on the corner of Don Pienaar and Pierre van Ryneveld, there's a property that's zoned for church property. And so, we were actually doing prayer walks on the corner of Don Pienaar and Herzog, but and Pierre van Ryneveld, everything on the other side, we were just praying on the wrong side of the road.
We had to just cross the other side to find it on this side.
So Carel started inquiring about the property, found out that it is zoned for a place of public worship or a school. And then the process started for us to lease the property from the government. And I think that was about a 3-year process.
Yeah.
It was really a tough one. We had to get them the education department to sign off on the property, that it's too small for them to have a school and that there are enough schools in our area. That was a process. And then eventually get them to be willing to lease it to a church. By the grace of God and with lots and lots and lots and lots of miracles, I don't think we've got the time to share all the miracles, but we got the lease on the property in 2009.
Yeah.
So we got the lease on the property in 2009, but we actually only moved here in 2011 because in the meantime, we had a bit of an apostasy or a church split. I don't know how to put it differently. That was a very, very difficult time for Carel and myself. But as I grow older, I realized it wasn't just difficult for us. It was difficult for those who were part of our church as well. Recently, I started inviting everyone to the 20 years, and I was actually just reminded about how many people impacted our lives and how many lives we impacted during that time. But unfortunately, it happened that half of our church, well, more than half, left in the process. So from a church where we had 2 services on a Sunday, we were suddenly left with like 30 people, I think.
We had to plant all over again.
Yeah, so that was very tough for me. I'm going to be like 100% eerlik. I struggled with that one because, in the eyes of the world, there's a certain standard that you need to reach to be successful in the eyes of men. So we were getting there, man. We were well on our way. In actual fact, we were like proving everyone wrong that we thought we wanted to prove wrong. And whatever your reasons are. But the point is the Lord wants the reason for your church to be Him and nothing else. So, it was very difficult, but it was extremely necessary. So, Carel, just after, in the middle of all of this, like I said, it was very difficult, and I really felt that I had depression. I know it was really difficult. But in all of this, Prophet Graham came from England for a summit. So during this whole plant, we just have to mention it. We planted for the AFM, and we were really doing everything for the AFM. Carel was a pastor in the AFM. But during it all, the people who supported us most were Harvester.
From
Apostle Andre, Apostle Aja, they often came to support us because they are church planters. So they actually understood what we were going through. They could give us advice. We did their Bible school from very early in our church plant. I think year 3, we started their Bible school, so it wasn't new to us. So we had the influence of Apostle Andre and them in our lives, and with that Prophet Graham as well. So
I just want to interject here. Being young as well, when we decided, okay, we're going to go for the church plant, we didn't know anybody that planted churches. And the only people we knew was Apostle Andre and Prophet Nola, and we knew them from my dad. They were friends. And they many times went and preached in Babsfontein, so I got to know them there. And we decided one day that we're going to drive down to Cape Town, not knowing how far Cape Town was. I first washed the car, we just had a wimpy, we sort of, and then we're going to drive to Cape Town. We
left at 12 o'clock.
At 12 on our way to Cape Town, and we drove and drove and drove until we got to Cape Town.
At 12.
Never knowing that was their first summit.
Yeah, so it was their first summit.
We joined them on their first summit that they had. There the Lord gave me a word already then that the Lord will give me new shoes. But I have to take off the old shoes and discard them, because if I don't call it obsolete, I would tend to want to go back to the comfort of the old shoes. And we didn't understand all of that
then. We obviously thought the new was the plant.
Yeah.
Planting a church, that's new. We've never done that before. But what the Lord actually meant was a new way.
And that was the original word. I'm going to do a new thing,
and that was the original word that the Lord
And the whole thing with the apostasy, brought us into that new thing.
So that's why I say it was very necessary. So yeah, Apostle Graham came to visit, and he didn't know anything about anything, and there are many stories to be told about that one visit. But I think the one that stands out the most is that he gave us a word that said the Lord allowed the situation so that we can go into a different direction. The river, which was actually linked to our church then, it was a depiction of our church, was going strong. It was flowing strong, but it was flowing in the wrong direction. And the Lord allowed this diversion to come so that we can move into a more accurate flow.
Yeah, so the lesson that one needs to learn is that every church has got a specific calling, specific mantle. Every ministry has got a specific grace that is upon it, And being young, you sort of do what others do. So you just follow the trend. You follow what other people do. And I had to learn, Hilana and myself had to discover the apostolic mandate upon our lives. We had to discover what God's purpose would be for this local church in Pier van Ryneveld as well. And sometimes the only way to be trained in these things is when you go through suffering, and when you go through trials, and when you go through difficult seasons, So at long last, we both died in that whole thing,
Somewhere in between it all, I can actually remember where I was standing, in which house, in what kitchen. I was very upset about, I can't remember what happened. And remember now, everyone who were in our church were really our friends. So yeah, it was really, to me it felt like somebody died, and before they died they said, I don't really like you, and then they died. It was terrible. Anyway, so I was standing in the kitchen and I was saying to the Lord, are you trying to kill me? And his soft yet firm reply was, yes.
Yeah.
I am. And I think I got it there. I realized I'm going to have to die for this to work. And we went to our second summit.
Yeah, the first one.
The first one was
and
the
then
one we
many
drove
years not,
all night.
and then the second one.
And then we didn't go. And then the second one was just in the midst of this whole apostasy and Prophet Graham coming. He then said to us, listen, I'm here for the summit. Just come with me to the summit. So we made a plan because financially it was not possible. But somehow, I can't even remember how the Lord provided, but a plan was made and we left, and we had 2 babies, so they had to stay with Janelle, my mom, and my dad for us to be able to go, but it was just a 3-day trip. So we went, and Prophet Nola knew me because of my parents, and she said to me, listen, tell me about what happened to you. And as I told her, I couldn't stop crying, I was weeping like a crazy person. I couldn't even properly say the words. I was just crying. And she turned to me and she said to me, you know what? You've entered the sufferings of Christ. And she stood up and she walked away. And my brain couldn't accept that.
Comprehend
I just couldn't. Yeah. I was like, what does that mean? I've entered the sufferings of Christ. I never heard that in my whole life. What do you mean I've entered the sufferings of Christ? And I stood up because we were in the eating hall and everyone was moving back towards where we had church. And I was walking alone, and I remember walking up the stairs. It was then Simonstown. Walking up the stairs, and suddenly it became a revelation in my life that you've entered the sufferings of Christ. For me in that moment meant, because it can mean different things for different people, but for me in that moment it meant that he was rejected and spoken badly about and treated very unfairly, and I now understand what that means. And for the first time in my whole life, I cried because he died for me. I mean, remember now, I just told you I got saved when I was 7. Elke keer wanneer die tannies huil met nagmaal, dan sê ek soos, why are you crying? Why are you crying? And here I am. I think I was 30 then. I didn't like being 30, remember?
She didn't even have a birthday.
I didn't have a birthday party.
She didn't want a birthday for 30.
This is not my best year. So 40 we celebrated, but 30.
Yeah, 30 was not a big celebration.
So I for the first time in my life, I realized a little bit of what Christ suffered on my behalf. And as we read Matthew, and we're now busy with Mark, I see it all over. Every time I see it again, I see what the Pharisees did to him. Not that I'm saying anyone around us were Pharisees. Please, people, don't take offense. But I see what the Pharisees did to him. I see what his own family did to him. I see what the people in Nazareth did to him. They rejected his teachings because he was just Jesus, the guy we grew up with, you know. And I realized that, well, I chose a different way of living. So that is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm going to have to make peace with that. And that, I think, is where our turnaround, for me, definitely happened.
So from my perspective, just, you know, an apostasy is opposition to good and true doctrine. So at that stage, you know, we had a second pastor that came in and he didn't work out properly, and you know, there were stirrings and a lot of things, but the big thing happened when there was an opposition to the doctrine that was being preached at that time. And not knowing that then, but now we know that God uses us as pioneers. So a lot of things that Hilana and myself do when we worship, when I preach, when we go into different nations, is to pioneer things, to pioneer new ways of thinking, new perspectives. That's part of an apostolic mantle that we didn't understand yet. And we went into that, a pastor and a pastor's wife, and we came out with an apostolic call and apostolic mandate. Not completely understanding it yet, but knowing that it is something different.
I guess that's one of the drawbacks of starting or planting very young, because you still have to discover a lot about who God wants you to be, about your own personality, how you handle certain situations, what's the better way to handle it. I mean, often when I look back at the apostasy, I realize that I was immature in very many ways, in the way that I handled the rejection. I could have really handled it better, but I was 30. I've never been rejected in my whole life. Verstaan? I grew up in a pastor's house. How do you say it? I was a PK. So, I mean, everybody just loved me. It was amazing. And now you don't like me? What's wrong with you? So yeah, it was a journey to realize that you are not God's gift to this earth.
Frank Sinatra used to sing, "I did it my way."
You cannot be doing it your way.
And the Lord just said, no, it's my way, not your way. You know, so we sort of had to get that in that season.
So that was